Welcome back for the penultimate video in the series. In the last video we enlisted the help of Willow and Devron to learn all about darkness tiles. Unfortunately, Devron is still in hospital and Willow is suing the channel for unsafe work practices, so let's return to our main heroes, Maya and Lordwrath. Last time we saw them, they were about to set off on another quest to retrieve the Tome of Expansion Rules, which has been stolen by a cult of fanatics. Andreas the Sage has just opened an interdimensional portal, allowing them to follow the cultists, and they've emerged into an environment which is both oddly familiar and yet very, very different. Wow, where the hell are we? Everything's so vivid and three-dimensional.
Yes, it seems a lot crappier than the place we came from. Why are there greasy fingerprints all over my initiative card?
Everyone's pretty grey looking too. Could do with a coat of paint.
Well, maybe the Game Master has been too busy making these videos to do any painting, and maybe you should cut him some slack.
Hey Al, check out these tokens. They're made of real cardboard. Talk about premium.
Cut it out, and don't call me Al. It sounds like a girl's name.
Oh my god, look at the size of this initiative tracker. It's bigger than I am. Come and take a selfie.
Stop that. You're supposed to be standing over here, on that tile E3-F.
Can I play with these cubes?
No, let us begin before people start writing mean comments.
Oh, alright then. You may have noticed that I keep skipping over the map setup, so let's take a very quick look at this example. It's not the map we're playing on, it's actually taken from the official tutorial, but it covers the essential points. On the right is a list of monsters you need to spawn, based on the number of heroes. For example, if you were playing with just one hero, you'd spawn everything above the dotted line, and if you had 5 heroes, you'd spawn everything. You can choose which of these asterisks your hero starts on. And when you eventually open a door, it will contain a new map with a little yellow arrow pointing away from the door you just opened. So that arrow tells you how to connect the new rooms to the existing ones. Opening a door can trigger all sorts of surprises, as described on the door card, but note that opening a door doesn't end your turn, or even your movement. In other words, you can open a door and set up a new map halfway through a move action. Now let's take a look at the map we'll be playing on. Maya and Lordwrath are over here on the left, and there are 3 monsters on the right. There's a bridge linking the 2 dungeon trays, and below the bridge we have some poisonous gas, or toxic miasma as it's called, on one side, and water on the far side. The cloud of gas will inflict poison too on anyone unlucky enough to enter it, and moving through water costs 1 additional point of movement per turn. And we're finally facing some worthy opponents, a white, a grey and a black monster. The Shadow Knight has 15 health points, and because he's a large monster, he moves from area to area. Large monsters are so heavy they can't be pushed around, so they're immune to push, telekinesis and knockdown. He's at the top of the monster track and has a yellow base. Then we have the truly disgusting rotten flesh. I've chosen the card which flips back and forth between the A side and the B side each time it activates. He starts with 12 health and is sporting a fashionable dark blue base. And finally, in a daring fuchsia outfit, there's a scrawny but dangerous skeleton archer. He only has 9 health points, but his multi-shot keyword means that he can fire off a couple of arrows each round. By the way, I'm not going to show an entire game, but we'll look at some highlights to reinforce the rules we've already learned and pick up some new ones. As you can see from the initiative track, the skeleton archer is the first to activate, and here are all the steps a monster may go through on its turn. Monsters keep condition tokens to the left of their health track, and of course the archer has none. Triggered abilities are printed on the monster's card in bright pink, like this, and the archer has none. By the way, triggered abilities are a bit of a misnomer because they're not actually triggered by events or conditions. They just activate near the start of the monster's turn. The preparation step involves choosing a target and determining how the monster will move. I like to think of it as just planning the next 2 actions, namely move and attack. This planning can involve a number of different rules, so let's take a detailed look. Although targeting and movement are often interrelated, I find that it helps to break them into 2 separate steps. First, determine which hero, or heroes, the monster will try to reach, and then determine where it will move to, and which path it will take. Let's look at the targeting rules first. The number 1 priority for monsters is to attack as many heroes as possible. Some monsters are able to attack multiple heroes on their turn, and even if they can't, they'll try to attack at least one hero, and if they can't do that, they'll try to get as close as possible. There are more targeting and movement rules to come, but none of them will override that, so you can think of it as the golden rule. The second rule is to attack the strongest hero. Technically, we call this the primary target. By default, that means the strongest hero, but some rules or keywords may change the primary target to someone else. These rules are listed in descending order of priority, which means that attacking the strongest hero is less important than the first rule. Let's see an example. We have a monster with a movement value of 2 and a melee attack. If it had an effect like multi-shot, cleave or strike printed on its card, then it could target multiple heroes with its attack. But it doesn't have any of those, so it can only target a single hero. Now let's put 3 heroes on the board. The strongest hero is over here, but notice that the monster won't target them because they're too far away, and there are other heroes within reach. The first rule, about maximising the number of heroes, means that monsters prefer heroes they can reach. In this case, both of the other heroes are within reach, so the monster will target the stronger of the two, with 6 hit points. In this next example, we have a similar monster, but this one has the keyword cleave too. This allows it to target up to 2 adjacent enemies. The strongest hero is over here, but in this situation the monster will move east and attack these 2 heroes, because of rule number 1. Now let's add one last targeting rule. Monsters will attack pets and companions if they can, but it's always the lowest priority. In other words, a pet or companion will never cause a monster to change their primary target. I'll rewind the previous example and add a pet to the board. In this case, the outcome is no different. The monster will still move to the right and attack the 2 heroes, because of rule number 1. It wants to maximise the number of heroes it can attack, and a pet isn't a hero. And that's all 3 of the targeting rules in a nutshell. Once you've determined who the monster will target, there are some additional rules to help you resolve the monster's movement. In other words, which square it will try to reach and what path it will take. But we'll save those rules for later in this video. For now, let's get back to our game and find out whom the archer wants to target. The archer has the multi-shot 2 ability. This is a ranged attack which targets up to 2 enemies. And as we just learned, the first rule of Fight Club means that it will always try to attack 2 heroes if it can. And if it can't, it will try to reach at least one of them. And if it can't reach either hero, it will try to get as close as possible. It has a movement value of 4, and it has an attack with range 1, which means that it will try to reach an area adjacent to the heroes. Luckily for us, it doesn't have quite enough movement to get within range. He takes 4 steps diagonally to get as close as possible and makes it onto the bridge. That was actually a close shave for Lordwrath, because if the archer had had just one more point of movement, he would have jumped down into the water on the far side of the bridge, and that would have put him within range of Lordwrath. But we were lucky. So the archer ends his turn. Next it's the Shadow Knight's turn. He doesn't have any conditions, but he does have a trigger ability in pink, so he gains 1 shield. Now let's figure out what he'll do. Notice that his attack uses the keyword strike 2. Strike is a targeting technique which allows an effect to target an entire area rather than a single space. In this case we have strike 2, which means target up to 2 whole areas, which is 8 spaces altogether. In this case, strike is used to perform an attack, but be aware that sometimes a strike can have positive effects. For example, if a hero performed a heal ability with strike 1, then they could heal up to 4 characters in one area, and you can pick and choose which of the 4 spaces will be affected. Naturally, strikes use the same range restrictions as everything else. The Shadow Knight has a melee attack, so strike 2 lets him target any 2 adjacent areas. Now that we understand his attack, let's look at his movement. Of course, he's a large monster, so he moves from one area to the next. He has 2 points of movement to spend, and we know that he'll try to reach an area which is adjacent to both heroes if he can. Once again, we're fortunate that the Shadow Knight, with the yellow base, is a long way from our heroes. If he had enough movement, he would try to reach one of these areas so that he could attack both heroes. By the way, one of those areas contains a chest, but that wouldn't prevent the Shadow Knight from ending his movement there. Even though treasure chests are solid objects, which normally can't be moved through, large monsters can move through areas containing a chest. and if they end their movement on top of a chest, they crush it, which means removing the chest from the board and rolling the trap die to see if it affects the large monster. But in our game, the Shadow Knight has only 2 points of movement, so he'll have to settle for getting as close as possible. The first thing I notice is that if he takes a step northwest, he'll step onto harmful terrain, namely poisonous gas. As we'll see later in this video, monsters will sometimes move through harmful terrain, but only when it's necessary for them to reach their targets. In this case it's not necessary, so he'll take a less harmful path. We already know that when moving, monsters can pass through monsters and heroes can pass through heroes. So it should come as no surprise that for his first step he can move north. But it may come as a surprise that for his second step he'll move northwest and end his movement on the bridge. Normally a monster can't end its movement in a space which is already occupied by another monster, but large monsters are an exception. The Shadow Knight simply shoves the archer aside and takes up the whole area. The skeleton archer gets shoved into a space which is adjacent to the Shadow Knight, and the players can choose which space. In fact, the rulebook says that players may even choose a position which seems most advantageous to them. Of course, you might do this differently, but I'm going to shove the archer off the near side of the bridge and into the toxic gas. That makes room for the Shadow Knight and inflicts poison too on the archer. Note that large monsters can't shove heroes or anything other than small monsters. The Shadow Knight isn't close enough to attack, so that's the end of his turn, and now Maya leaps into action. First, she takes a couple of steps forward. Then she uses her coordinated strike skill. That uses a red action cube, so she can target the Shadow Knight at range 1. It gives her 2 attacks with a +0 chance to hit, and her crossbow needs a roll of 9 or more to hit. Okay, that's a 7, which is a miss, and a 12, which is a hit. The crossbow does 5 points of damage, so the Shadow Knight loses his shield token and 4 health points. Coordinated Strike also lets her activate one of her pets. Activating a pet lets you either summon one adjacent to the hero, or if a pet is already on the board, you can give it a turn. In this case, I'll place her pet Jinx, the eagle, in an empty space adjacent to Maya. Maya briefly considers ignoring the treasure chest so that Lordwrath can have it, but then her curiosity gets the better of her and she decides to loot it. I'll roll the trap die, and damn it, she suffers burn too. I'll draw a card from the treasure deck, and she gets a potion of healing. Okay, well that should help with the 3rd degree burns she just suffered, and of course the chest gets removed. By the way, that's the 2nd chest I've looted in this video series, and I don't think I've ever mentioned the fact that it's possible to loot a chest partway through a move action. So now you know. Anyway, Maya has 1 cube action remaining, and ever since I began making these videos, I've been just itching to lay down a bear trap. I think the time has come. There are 3 types of traps, represented by these 3 tokens, and apart from what they inflict, they all behave the same way. Maya's bear trap action uses a yellow action cube, and it lets her place a bear trap in the centre of an area which is adjacent to her own. So I think I'll place it on the bridge, right underneath the Shadow Knight. The area doesn't have to be empty. The trap has no immediate effect, but it will be triggered the next time the Shadow Knight activates, or even sooner if another monster enters that area. Also note that traps like these will only harm your enemies, not your allies. And that's Maya's turn over. Pets activate immediately after their owner's turn, so now we get to activate Jinx. A pet's turn is a lot like a monster's turn, namely resolve its conditions, move, then attack, in that order. The main difference is that pets' movement and targeting are entirely up to you. Sadly, pets only have 1 point of health, so they're pretty fragile. If they suffer damage, they don't die, but they get dismissed, in other words, removed from the board. But you can summon them again anytime you like. As you can see, Jinx can move up to 5 spaces. She has an attack which does 1 point of damage, and we have some keywords. The first 2 are highlighted in blue, indicating that they're passive special abilities. We've already met the jump effect from an earlier video, and of course that lets Jinx soar majestically overhead. And the flyby effect lets Jinx return to Maya's side after attacking. Intimidate 1 will inflict a condition on the target, but note that it's part of the attack, so it's considered collateral damage. As we learned, collateral damage only gets applied if the attack manages to reduce the target's health. In this case, I think I'll move Jinx just one space and attack the Shadow Knight. That reduces his health by 1, and the Intimidate condition will slightly reduce the power of his next attack. Then, thanks to the Flyby condition, Jinx returns to Maya's side. In this case I'll return her to where she started, but any empty space beside Maya would have been allowed. Now it's Lordwrath's turn. I'm going to start with his Overpressure skill. The blue Wisdom Cube gives it unlimited range, so I'm going to target Rotten Flesh with the giant claws. He suffers 4 damage, and the Telekinesis 3 effect picks him up off the ground and moves him by up to 3 squares. I think I'll move him just 1 square and toss him into the Toxic Miasma, which inflicts poison 2. Take that, you ugly monstrosity. For his second cube action, I think I'll use his Battle Focus skill and target Maya with that. This is pretty out of character for Lordwrath, so let's just say that he meant to target himself, but he somehow messed it up. Firstly, Maya gets a focus token. And since the topic came up, let's take a closer look at focus abilities. For the most part, these are fairly straightforward. A hero can spend focus tokens to perform one of the focus abilities printed on their hero board. Just like cube actions, they may have an icon to indicate a weapon attack, a spell attack, or a reaction. Naturally, they can only be performed on your turn, unless it's a reaction. Focus abilities aren't considered cube actions or minor actions, so they're additional to anything else you might do on your turn. And there's one last important rule whenever your focus ability displays the weapon attack icon. Normally, the range of a weapon attack is determined by the colour of the action cube used, but of course focus abilities don't use action cubes. So instead, we use the range printed on the weapon card. For example, Maya's Eeny Meeny Miny Mo ability is a weapon attack, so we'd refer to the range icon of her equipped weapon. Returning to our game, you'll recall that Lordwrath has just used his Battle Focus ability. Maya also gets hit with Cleanse 1. As mentioned previously, the Cleanse keyword got updated in the expansion rules. In these videos, I'm playing by the most up-to-date rules, so Cleanse 1 will remove Maya's burn condition. Hooray! Okay, Lordwrath still has his move action to go. I notice that both the Archer and the Shadow Knight have the potential to attack both heroes at once, which is not great. I think that positioning the two heroes a long way apart could help to prevent that from happening. Moving them apart may take a few rounds, but I'll get the ball rolling by having Lordwrath jump down into the water. He only moves 2 spaces because of course the water is difficult terrain. And that's the end of his turn. Next up is Rotten Flesh. Thanks to his poison condition, he immediately loses 2 health points. Sweet. And unlike most other conditions, poison doesn't get removed when it triggers. It just stays there. Of course, the cleanse effect can remove poison, but Rotten Flesh doesn't look like he's going to take a shower anytime soon. Next comes triggered abilities, highlighted in pink. He doesn't have any, so it's on to preparation. The first thing to notice is the keyword Covetous on his card. That's highlighted in blue because it's a passive ability, a lot like the passive abilities which heroes have. In this case, Covetous means that he will target the hero with the most resource tokens, such as shield and focus tokens. So he targets Maya, who has 1 focus token. By the way, when we looked at targeting rules earlier, we learned that the primary target is the strongest hero by default. Keywords like Covetous, Relentless and others redefine the primary target, but they never override the number 1 targeting rule, which is to attack the maximum number of heroes. Rotten Flesh has a melee attack against a single target, so he'll try to get adjacent to Maya, or as close as possible. He may attack a pet, if he can, but his primary target remains Maya. Rotten Flesh has 3 points of movement, which is not quite enough to reach Maya, but he can reach either of these squares, which are as close as he can get. When choosing a path to their target, monsters will consider 3 factors. They'll try to avoid hazardous terrain, they'll try to land on darkness, and they'll try to take the shortest path possible. These are listed in order of priority, and notice that taking the shortest path is the lowest priority. In other words, monsters are not lazy, and they'll often move further just so they can avoid hazardous terrain or stand on top of darkness. Also remember that none of these factors will override the monster's burning desire to reach their target or targets. And this turn is a good example. In order to get as close as possible to Maya, he'll have to move through more of the toxic gas. If there are several valid paths, like we have here, then the players can choose which one to use. Let's move him 3 spaces northwest. And of course the first step earned him another poison 2 token. So he's now maxed out on poison. He may not have reached Maya, but he is adjacent to Jinx the Eagle. And as mentioned, monsters will attack pets and companions if the opportunity arises. His attack does 4 points of damage, while Jinx has only 1 health point. When a pet or companion gets attacked, heroes may choose to intervene with one of their reaction skills, but there's not much I can do in this case. Rotten Flesh swings his enormous claws, and Jinx loses a few feathers, then flies off the battlefield. Sorry Jinx, that was on me. That's the end of Rotten Flesh's turn, so we flip his card to the B side. Now it's almost the end of the round. We just have to place a darkness tile. Lordwrath is the strongest hero, so the darkness will chase him. And there are a couple of spawn icons nearby. The small L-shaped darkness tile could fit on the map, but it wouldn't get very near to Lordwrath. So it will split into 3 smaller tiles because that allows it to get even closer. Of course the first tile goes on the spawn icon, and there are a few different ways to place the other 2 tiles. I think I'll place them like this. The darkness doesn't quite reach him, but it was a close call. I'll place the rune token on the initiative track and I'll flip the darkness card. And that's the end of the round, and now we're into round 2. The skeleton archer has poison 2, so he loses 2 health points and his lunch. Multi-shot 2 gives him a single attack with up to 2 targets. That's a ranged attack, so he will try to reach an area which is range 1 from both heroes, if he can. Remember that monsters can't perform ranged attacks if they're engaged in combat, so the archer would be unable to attack at all from any of these squares, all of which are adjacent to at least one hero. In contrast, any of these squares, to the left of the bridge, would be perfect because they're within range 1 of both heroes, but not directly adjacent to them. Now that he's chosen his targets, let's consider his movement. As we've already seen, heroes can move through heroes, and monsters can move through monsters. So the archer can move across the bridge, even though it's occupied by the Shadow Knight. And if we look at the monster movement rules again, we can see that the skeleton will take just 2 steps, 1 step up onto the bridge and 1 step to the west. That avoids the hazardous terrain and is the shortest path to reach its targets. And that works out rather well for us, because as you may recall from the previous round, Maya placed a bear trap on the bridge. As soon as the archer steps up onto the bridge, the trap goes off, and it hits both the archer and the Shadow Knight. Hooray! Of course, the trap token gets removed. Bear traps have 2 effects. First, they inflict 2 points of damage. And secondly, they inflict 2 points of bleed. Unfortunately, the skeleton archer is immune to bleed, but the Shadow Knight isn't. Now the skeleton archer performs his attack, which does 3 points of damage to each hero. This incoming damage is sometimes referred to as a threat. If either of the heroes had shield tokens, then those would soak up some of that damage before anything else happens. But sadly, Maya and Lordwrath don't even have a single shield token between them. But they can perform reaction skills, which are cube actions marked with a lightning bolt icon. Lordwrath's parry and riposte skill is a perfect example. Man, I would love to use that skill right now, but unfortunately he doesn't have any blue action cubes to spend. Never mind. Without going into too much detail, here are a few pretty important rules related to reactions. Firstly, reactions occur after shield tokens have done their bit, which means that you can't use a reaction to preserve your shield tokens. Secondly, this is a highly cooperative game, and heroes can react to threats against their allies even when they're not being targeted themselves. The one notable exception to this rule is the retaliate effect. A hero can only retaliate against an attack which targets themselves. If your hero has a retaliate ability, it's worth memorizing this rule. And finally, each hero can perform a maximum of 1 reaction per threat. In our game, even though the skeleton archer performed a single attack, it generated 2 threats. The threats are simultaneous, but let's deal with them one at a time, starting with the threat against Lordwrath. He decides to use the Endure skill on his plate armour, and that prevents all 3 points of damage. The Skeleton Archer also has Poison 1. Because that's tied to his attack, it's referred to as collateral damage, and it only gets applied if the archer manages to inflict at least 1 point of damage. In this case, Lordwrath managed to prevent all the damage, so he doesn't suffer the poison either. This rule applies to all conditions and effects which are part of a monster's attack. Maya also decides to use her armour. She's wearing leather armour, which doesn't provide quite as much protection, but it is light and nimble. The Tumble skill prevents 2 points of damage and allows her to take a move 2 action. Even though more reactions might be possible, for example, Lordwrath might also react to the threat against Maya, let's call it quits. Maya only prevented 2 points of damage, so her health goes down by 1, and she also suffers the collateral damage of Poison 1. And for her move action, I think she wants to move away from both Lordwrath and the darkness. Next it's the Shadow Knight's turn. He suffers 2 points of damage from his bleed condition, and we remove that token. Then his triggered ability gives him a shield token. His Strike 2 ability lets him target 2 adjacent areas, so he could attack both heroes from either of these areas. I think I'll move him northwest. Normally, his attack would deal 5 points of damage, but the Intimidate 1 condition on his monster track reduces that by 1, to only 4. As a reaction, Maya decides to use the Veil of Light skill on her dungeon roll card. That prevents 2 points of damage for up to 2 characters. Note that the prevent effect always targets the character you're trying to protect, not the monster who's performing the attack. Maya and Lordwrath are so far apart that she'll need to use a green or blue action cube with unlimited range if she wants this to protect Lordwrath. So I think I'll use a blue cube. Lordwrath would react to the attack if he could, but he just doesn't have any reactions available right now, which means that reactions are over and both heroes lose 2 points of health. And because they lost some health, they also suffer any collateral damage, in this case knockdown. As we'll see shortly, the knockdown condition cancels your next movement. With his attack over, we remove the Intimidate token. And that's the end of the Shadow Knight's turn. We're on to Maya's turn, so let's see if we can turn things around. Unfortunately, she loses 1 point of health to poison, and of course the condition token stays on her board. Nasty. I'll start by using her free movement action. Unfortunately, the knockdown condition cancels that, so she stays put. But at least we get to remove the condition. It occurs to me that a couple of bolts from Maya's crossbow would be enough to take down the Shadow Knight, so I'm going to use her rapid shot skill. That's a ranged weapon attack, so we must make sure that she isn't engaged in combat to use it. Fortunately, she isn't, and the Shadow Knight is within range, so we're good to go. She gets 2 separate attacks, each with a +0 chance to hit. Her crossbow needs a result of 9 or more to hit, and we don't have any modifiers. Okay, that's a 6, which is a miss. And a 7, which is another miss. Damn. Of course, she has 1 more cube action to go, but her only unspent action cube is green, so that limits her choices a bit. And speaking of not having enough action cubes, it's about time I introduced the Willing Recall action. In an earlier video, we learned about the Unwilling Recall action. That involves recalling all your action cubes and gaining a curse cube every time you run out of them. But it's also possible to recall your action cubes before they've all been spent. So you can think of it as a voluntary recall, because you're choosing to do it. For the most part, this works the same way as every recall. You recover all your action cubes and you gain a curse cube. And if it's your 6th curse cube, you die. But there are a few extra rules you need to know. Firstly, you can only perform a willing recall if you have 2 or less colours of action cubes remaining. In our game, Maya has only 1 colour left, so it's allowed. Secondly, you can only do this on your turn. And thirdly, doing so will immediately end your turn. Before we consider Maya's options, let's see an example where a willing recall would be really useful. Here, Vaughn the warrior is about to end his turn. He's in the midst of a fierce battle, and it looks like he'll probably be targeted by some monsters before his next turn. With no shield tokens on hand, he'll want to have at least 1 reaction skill at the ready. but the reactions on his armour and his dungeon roll card are already blocked with cubes. And the one on his player board requires a blue action cube, which he doesn't have available. So the next round of combat could go badly for Vaughn. Fortunately though, his available action cubes are in only two colours, yellow and red, so he's free to perform a willing recall. Obviously that will earn him another curse cube, sooner than if he'd done nothing, but in this case it's well worth the trade-off. In our game, Maya could perform a willing recall, but that would just end her turn. It makes a lot more sense to just spend her last action cube, which will trigger a recall anyway. The final thing I'll say about recalls is that although they're free, you can't perform one in the middle of an action. Always complete your current action, then perform the recall. So I'll spend her last cube on Remove Curse, which removes her poison condition and heals 2 health. It also triggers an unwilling recall and of course a curse cube, which I'll put on this not very useful agility skill. And that's the end of Maya's turn. Lordwrath is up next. I'll use his free move action to remove the knockdown condition. Then I'll activate his execution skill with a red cube. That says target an enemy with 6 or less hit points. The target dies. And he targets the archer, who has only 5 health remaining. I'll remove his tokens from the monster track, his mini from the board, and his card from the initiative track. Nice one. For Lordwrath's second cube action, I think I'll perform Mortal Blow and target the Shadow Knight. They're adjacent, so a yellow action cube should do the trick. Mortal Blow has a +0 chance to hit, but we have a couple of other modifiers to consider. This passive skill on his dungeon roll card gives us +1 chance to hit. And because he's attacking from a lower elevation, he gets -2 to hit. So that's -1 altogether. Let's see what he rolls. A 16! That is awesome, because Mortal Blow treats 16 or more as a critical hit. As mentioned, criticals are always based on the number you rolled, not the modified result. To calculate the damage, we get 3 from his weapon, plus 1 from Mortal Blow makes 4, and that's doubled by the critical hit, making 8 damage, which is just enough to remove his shield token and kill him. Yes! Begone, foul servant of corruption and decay. Lordwrath's turn is about to end, and I think I'll also perform a willing recall action. Not because I think it's a good idea, but just because I can. And I'll place the curse cube on his shadow arcing skill. It's now Rotten Flesh's turn, and he starts by losing 4 health points to poison. His initiative card is now on the B side, and notice that it doesn't have any movement or even an attack. Instead, it has the triggered abilities Shield 4 and Evolve. The Evolve keyword gives him +2 damage and +1 movement from now on. In this case, all those buffs are pretty academic since he's a dead man walking. At the very start of his next turn, he's going to take 4 points of poison damage and immediately die. That's the end of Rotten Flesh's turn, so I'll flip his card back to the A side. Now that all the monsters have been dealt with, Maya and Lordwrath can focus on reaching their interaction token, hopefully without wading through too much darkness, and retrieve the Tome of Expansion rules, which is what they came for. And since this video has gone on long enough, let's just say that they succeed. Well done, guys. Thanks for watching, and I hope this video helped to reinforce your confidence with some of the rules. The next video is the final in the series, and in that we'll take a look at brand new rules used in the Apocalypse and Awakenings expansions. See you there.